Snow flurried around her in jagged sheets, the wind clawing at her like unseen hands. Each step tore at the soles of her feet, half numb, half burning, boots slick with ice. Her breath came in short, desperate bursts, white clouds in the moonlight, each one stolen too quickly by the storm. She didn't dare look back. The forest behind her was too alive with sound, a shifting in the frost-laden branches, a whisper of padded feet over snow, a low growl that rolled like distant thunder. She ran harder. Her lungs screamed. Her vision blurred at the edges. Blood from a cut on her palm slicked the haft of the knife she gripped, her only weapon, its wooden handle as cold as the eyes of those who had cast her out. The rejection still echoed in her mind, not as words but as wounds. The Alpha's voice, sharp and final, "You are not one of us." The crowd's silence, colder than the winter air. The look in her mother's eyes, a look she couldn't name because it hurt too much to try. The icy wind sliced across her cheeks, carrying with it the sting of that night, the night she lost everything. But here in the blackened trees, the storm felt almost merciful. At least the wind didn't lie. Somewhere behind her, the snow crunched, deliberate, measured. Not the careless noise of an animal. Someone was following. Her heart lurched. She changed direction, veering toward a hollow in the slope ahead, snow falling heavier here, swirling in eddies like 1,000 whispering ghosts. She crouched behind a tangle of roots, chest heaving, straining to hear over the pounding in her ears. Silence. Only the wind, the rasp of her own breath. She dared to glance down at her hands. The silver light was there again. A faint shimmer danced across her fingertips, as though the frost itself had caught fire. She curled her fists, forcing the glow to dim, burying her hands into the snow until the skin burned. If he saw, it would be over before it began. A twig snapped to her right. Her head jerked toward the sound. The fog shifted, shapes moving between the pines, too tall to be wolves, too fluid to be men. The wind shifted. And with it came the scent, faint, yet so sharp it cut through the cold, wood smoke, leather, and something darker, something primal. She didn't know if it meant danger or salvation. And she couldn't decide which she feared more. She pushed up from the snow, legs trembling, and started forward again, deeper into the maze of trees. The ground here sloped down sharply, the ice hidden beneath powder pulling her feet out from under her. She slid, caught herself against a half-buried rock, and bit back a cry. Somewhere behind, footsteps quickened. Whoever it was, they weren't hiding now. Her pulse roared in her ears. She cut left, weaving between fallen logs, ducking low under clawed branches. Snow stung her eyes. The cold was in her bones now, numbing thought and feeling alike, but still she kept moving. Her boot caught on a root. She pitched forward, catching herself hard on her hands. Pain shot up her arms, but worse was the warmth she felt seeping through her fingers, fresh blood, spilling fast into the white snow. She tried to rise. Couldn't. Her strength was slipping away like the last light of dusk. And still, that scent. Closer now. Stronger. The forest went quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She forced herself to turn, and through the veil of snow, a figure emerged. Tall. Broad. Moving with the ease of someone who belonged to this land in a way she never had. The hood of his cloak shadowed his face, but she felt his gaze as though it touched her skin. Her grip tightened on the knife. If he came closer, she would fight. Even if she couldn't win. Her vision swam. A shadow passed across the moon. And then, before she could speak, before she could run, the world tilted, blackness closing in. Her last thought was not of fear, but of that scent, and the strange heat it left in her chest. 20-minute mark CTA, studio microphone narrator, low and intimate. If you want to know what happens when she wakes, stay with me. And subscribe to the Alpha's Romance Library for more tales that burn long after the last word fades. She awoke to the sound of water. A slow, steady trickle, the frozen stream she'd seen before the darkness took her. But she wasn't lying in the snow anymore. The air was still cold, but it carried a different weight here, damp, shadowed, almost safe. Her eyes adjusted to the pale light seeping through cracks in what seemed to be a stone wall. And then she heard it, the soft crunch of boots on frost. He was here. And this time, there was nowhere to run. The sound of boots drew closer, slow but deliberate, the kind of pace that belonged to someone who knew they would not be outrun. She forced her eyes open, but the world swam in blurred shapes and shadows, the pale light fractured like ice beneath a frozen lake. Her pulse kicked hard in her throat. The walls around her, rough stone, damp with melting frost, told her she was somewhere enclosed, yet not entirely sheltered. She could still hear the wind outside, hear the faint groan of trees shifting in the storm. And then he appeared. A tall, broad figure filled the narrow opening of the cave. The cold followed him in like an obedient hound, curling around his boots, but his presence seemed to push the shadows back. He moved closer, crouching beside her with a slow, measured ease, a predator's grace. She flinched when his hand settled on her shoulder. The weight of it was solid, grounding, but she felt the strength coiled beneath it, barely restrained. Her senses, still muddled from exhaustion, registered the scent first, deep and layered. Leather warmed by skin. The faint tang of iron. And beneath it all, something wild and raw, like pine smoke curling over embers. It slid into her lungs before she could stop it, sparking a heat low in her chest that had nothing to do with the thin blanket of warmth in the cave. She tried to push herself upright, but her limbs betrayed her, trembling under their own weight. His gaze locked on hers, sharp and assessing, and the room seemed to shrink until there was nothing in it but him. Those eyes. Not the gold of her old alpha, nor the cold steel of the hunters. They were a deep, unreadable gray, catching the cave's light just enough to glint, as if they held storms of their own. You shouldn't be here. The voice was low, threaded with an edge that sent a shiver along her spine. She parted her lips to answer, but he spoke again before she could shape the words. Her name. He said her name as if it were a truth he had carried for years. Her breath stalled. She had never seen him before, yet he spoke it with the certainty of someone who had. How, she began, the question splintering in her throat. His expression didn't shift. I've been watching. Every muscle in her body tightened. Watching. The word should have frightened her more than the storm, but there was no mockery in his tone, no threat laced in it, only fact. You're hurt. It wasn't a question. His gaze dropped briefly to her palm, still crusted with dried blood. Before she could react, he reached for her hand. Her instinct was to pull back, but he held it firm, not painfully, just enough to still her resistance. The warmth of his skin against hers was startling after the cold, seeping in like heat from a fire she'd been denied too long. He turned her hand over, thumb brushing lightly over the cut. The silver spark pulsed faintly in her fingertips, and her stomach lurched with panic. He looked up sharply, too sharply. For a heartbeat she thought he'd seen it. But he said nothing. I can walk, she said, though she doubted it. His mouth curved, not quite a smile, not quite a smirk, before he slid an arm beneath her knees and another behind her back, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. She hated the way her body reacted, the brief drop in her chest as the ground fell away, the quickened beat of her pulse at the feel of his strength. You don't need to, save your breath. The words were clipped, but not unkind. The cold hit her face as he stepped out of the cave, snow swirling immediately around them. His stride was sure despite the ice, his balance unshaken even when the wind gusted hard against them. She kept her gaze on the forest ahead, refusing to look up at him, and yet every step was a reminder of his presence, of the steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint thud of his heartbeat against her side. They moved through the trees until the land opened suddenly to a narrow ridge, the drop below hidden by thick fog. He stopped, shifting his hold so her boots touched the ground, steadying her with one strong hand at her waist. The heat that flared there was instant, startling, a sudden awareness of just how close he was, of the way his fingers seemed to linger just long enough to be deliberate. Her eyes lifted to his, and for a fraction of a second, she saw something unguarded flicker there. Not warmth. Not pity. Something heavier. It vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the same unreadable calm. "I'm not your friend," he said, voice low enough that the wind nearly stole it away. The words should have cut, but they didn't. They landed somewhere deeper, curling into the same place where his scent had settled. "Then why?" she asked before she could stop herself. His gaze drifted past her, toward the fog-shrouded valley beyond, as if the answer lay somewhere she couldn't see. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, it was so soft she wasn't sure she'd heard it right. "Because leaving you there would have made me no better than them." She didn't ask who them was. The way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes stayed fixed on that unseen distance, it told her enough. He had his own ghosts. And she had just stepped into their shadow. They walked for hours, or maybe only minutes. Time was strange in the forest at night, stretched thin between the steady sound of boots on snow and the rush of blood in her ears. When they finally stopped, it was in a small hollow sheltered by a ring of dark pines. The wind still moved above them, but down here the air felt still, heavy with the faint scent of resin and the promise of fire. He lowered the pack from his shoulder, knelt, and with practiced motions gathered kindling. She sat a few paces away, her back against a fallen log, watching the flare of his flint as it sparked against steel. The flame caught quickly, licking at the wood until it grew into a low, steady burn. Shadows bent and shifted on the tree trunks, making the hollow seem deeper, the world outside farther away. She held her hands out toward the heat. The skin of her palms stung as the warmth reached them, the kind of ache that came from blood returning after too much cold. She curled her fingers into fists and let the fire's light draw her gaze downward, into places she had tried not to look for too long. It began with the moon. Always the moon. She saw it again as it had been that night, full and white, sharp-edged against a black sky, spilling silver light across the Alpha's hall. She stood in the center of the gathering place, every eye on her. Her heart had pounded so hard she'd been certain they could all hear it. But when the Alpha spoke, the hall was silent but for his voice. "You are a danger to the pack's survival." The words fell heavy, final. She remembered the way her legs trembled, not from fear, but from the effort to keep standing when all she wanted was to fold in on herself. She remembered faces in the crowd, some turned away, some blank, some twisted with a satisfaction they didn't bother to hide. And then, the spark. Uncontrolled, unbidden. It had leapt from her skin to the nearest torch, silver fire racing up the wood, spilling in a burst that licked across the beams of the hall. The crowd had gasped, some had backed away, others shouted for the elders. The flames hadn't burned like normal fire. They shimmered, almost liquid, and where they touched the carved walls, the wood had blackened but not broken. It had lasted only seconds before dying back into the air, but it had been enough. Enough to prove every whispered rumor true. The silver flame. A curse, they called it. A birthmark of destruction. Her throat tightened as she saw the memory shift, the way the Alpha had stepped back from her, the way her mother's hands had stayed folded at her sides instead of reaching for her. The night after, they had sent her away. No formal exile, no guards to march her beyond the borders, just a door closed in her face and the unspoken truth that there would be no welcome for her again. She left before dawn. Walked until her legs ached, slept where the ground was dry enough to curl on, kept to the edges of territories where no one would care enough to ask her name. Seasons changed. Packs shifted. She stayed in motion. And in all those years, not once had she found a place that felt like it could hold her without breaking. The fire between them cracked softly, pulling her back to the present. She realized he had not spoken once since they stopped, had only tended the fire, adjusted the wood, and let the quiet stretch between them. His gaze was on her now, steady, unblinking, but not prying. It was the kind of attention that wasn't hungry for answers but would take them if offered. She hated that it made her want to speak. Her fingers traced the rough edge of the cut on her palm. "They said I'd destroy them." He didn't look surprised. What did you do? The question was simple, but it pulled at her in ways she hadn't expected. She told him about the flame, about the night in the hall, the silver fire curling from her skin, the look on the alpha's face. He didn't interrupt. Didn't shift or glance away when she said the word cursed. When she finished, the firelight had dipped lower, casting more shadow than glow. Do you believe them? He asked finally. She opened her mouth to say yes, to speak the answer she had carried for years. But the word caught, snagged on something small and stubborn inside her. I don't know. He nodded once, as if that answer made sense. Then his gaze drifted to the fire, and for a moment, the shadows on his face deepened into something almost sorrowful. You should sleep, he said quietly. And though the tone was gentle, there was a weight beneath it, the kind that came from someone who knew exactly how it felt to carry too much for too long. The fire had burned low, nothing left but embers pulsing like a heartbeat in the ash. He stood without a word, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders, and she knew without asking that they would not rest here until morning. The forest felt different now. Not just cold, but expectant, as though something unseen had shifted when she spoke of the flame. The air was thicker, the silence too sharp, each sound in the distance standing out like a dropped stone in still water. She followed him through the pines, boots crunching softly in the snow, the moonlight filtering down in pale, fractured beams. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the only constant the rhythm of his steps ahead of hers and the faint trail of heat his presence left behind. When the trees finally broke, she found herself standing at the edge of a clearing unlike any she had ever seen. The snow here lay untouched, glistening under a moon that seemed impossibly bright, as if it hung lower in the sky just for this place. In the center stood a circle of stones, each taller than a man, their surfaces carved with markings so old they looked like they had grown there, etched into the stone by centuries of wind and rain. Her breath caught. It was not just the size of them, or their impossible symmetry, but the way the air seemed to hum around them. A low, resonant vibration she felt in her bones more than heard. He stepped into the circle without hesitation, glancing back only once to see if she would follow. Something inside her resisted, a small, instinctive recoil, as if stepping past those stones would be stepping into something she could not return from. But her feet moved anyway. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air changed. The cold was still there, but layered beneath it was a strange warmth, like the feeling of standing too close to lightning just before it strikes. Her eyes traced the carvings nearest to her. They were not random patterns, they were shapes she recognized, though she could not remember from where. Curved lines curling into spirals, jagged edges flaring like flames. And then she saw it. One symbol, carved deep into the tallest stone, caught the moonlight in such a way that it glowed faintly silver. Her breath stilled as she reached for her shoulder, fingertips brushing over the mark there, the same shape, the same lines. The silver flame. Here, carved into stone older than any living memory. Her voice was little more than a whisper. It's the same. He didn't answer right away. His gaze was on her, not the stone, his eyes holding the weight of someone who had seen this moment coming. They called it a curse, she said, the words sharper than she intended. They said it would destroy everything it touched. His voice was low, but there was something in it that made the hair at the back of her neck rise. Or it could be the only thing that saves them. She turned away, unwilling to let the thought take root. The carvings blurred as she moved from stone to stone, but the feeling only grew, a pull, gentle but insistent, drawing her deeper into the circle until she stood in its center. The moon shifted overhead, light spilling across the snow in a wide arc until it touched her boots. And then, impossibly, the air warmed again, the silver in the snow beginning to glow faintly, threads of light curling up around her ankles like mist. Her chest tightened. She wanted to step back, to break whatever was happening, but her body wouldn't listen. It was then that she heard it. Not a voice exactly, but something that moved through her mind like one. The one with the mark shall ignite the night and bind the Alpha King. The words were not spoken aloud, yet they vibrated in her bones the same way the stones did. She tried to push them away, but they sank deeper, lodging themselves in a place she could not reach. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She forced herself to look at him, standing just outside the circle, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "I don't believe in prophecies," she said, though her voice trembled. "Belief doesn't change truth," he replied. "And truth doesn't care if you're ready for it." She shook her head, stepping out of the light, the warmth fading as quickly as it had come. "I'm not what they think I am. I'm not this." She gestured toward the stones, the glowing snow, as if the word destiny itself was too heavy to speak. "You're not what they think you are," he said, taking a step closer. "That's why you're still alive." The moonlight shifted again, this time catching both of them in its glow. For a moment, it seemed to bend toward them, the silver deepening, sharpening, until the shadows retreated entirely from the circle. The hum in the air grew louder, the pull between them unmistakable now, not just in the way his gaze held hers, but in something beneath the skin, something that felt like the stones themselves were watching. And still, beneath the awe, the fear lingered. Because if the prophecy was true, then the fire inside her was not just hers to carry. It was meant to burn the world. The hum of the stones had barely faded when the first sound reached them, faint, muffled by the snow, but wrong. A rhythm that didn't belong to the forest. She felt it before she understood it, the way prey knows the approach of a predator, a shift in the air, a disturbance in the stillness that made the hair along her arms lift. His head turned sharply toward the treeline. They were no longer alone. The shapes emerged first as shadows between the pines, then as figures, tall, moving with deliberate precision, the snow bending under their weight. The moonlight caught on steel, blades, spear tips, and the glint of polished armor. Rival pack. She knew it before she could smell them. Their presence was sharp and foreign, the scent of blood and old iron clinging to their skin. Her pulse quickened. She stepped back until her shoulders brushed one of the great stones, the carvings digging cold and unyielding into her spine. They moved in a half-circle, cutting off the path they'd come from, their leader stepping forward. His fur-lined cloak swayed with the motion, and when he smiled, his teeth were too white, too sharp. "You brought her here," the man said, his voice carrying easily in the open air. "How interesting." The alpha beside her didn't answer, didn't shift his stance. But something in the air around him changed. The stillness was gone, in its place was a coiled readiness, the kind that came just before violence. "She's trespassing," the rival continued, eyes sliding over her like she was something to be appraised, not seen. "You know the law. Bloodline or not, she doesn't belong here." Her throat tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to defend, but the alpha's hand lifted slightly, not touching her, just enough to still her. "Go back to your camp," he said, his tone like tempered steel. The rival alpha laughed, the sound dry as cracking ice. "Not without her." Two of his men stepped forward. The moonlight caught on the edges of their blades, painting them in cold fire. The carvings behind her pulsed faintly, a trick of the light, or something else, and her shoulder throbbed where the mark lay hidden. Her fingers twitched. She felt the flame stir in her blood, restless, answering the tension in the air. Not now. Not in front of them. She forced it down, nails biting into her palms. "Step aside," the rival alpha said, voice dropping lower. "Unless you plan to make this your last night." The alpha at her side shifted then, not a step forward, not a step back, but the smallest movement of weight that told her he was ready to fight. His voice was quiet, but it carried, every syllable sharp. "Try." The attack came fast. The first man lunged, steel flashing. The alpha caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting hard until the blade clattered into the snow. A kick sent the second man sprawling. She pressed herself against the stone, breath quick, eyes darting between the fighters and the shadows at the edge of the circle. More shapes moved there, not men this time. Wolves, their eyes glinting gold and red in the moonlight, their growls low and rolling. One broke from the line, teeth bared, charging straight toward her. She didn't think, she moved. Her hands came up, and the silver fire burst from her palms before she could stop it, curling in the air like liquid light. It struck the ground between her and the wolf, flaring bright enough to throw the whole circle into stark relief. The wolf skidded to a halt, ears flattening, a whine caught in its throat. Silence fell for a breath, a single, fragile heartbeat, before the rival alpha's voice cut through it. "See," he said, his smile wider now. "The curse burns true." Her chest heaved. She could still feel the fire lingering on her skin, hot and unwilling to fade. And in that moment, she knew, whatever the prophecy meant, whatever destiny the stones whispered of, the world was already moving to claim it. The fight ended not in victory, but in retreat. Not his. Theirs. When the rival alpha's wolves finally pulled back into the tree-line, the stones stood silent again, the snow settling over churned earth and dark stains. The air still carried the taste of metal. He didn't speak. Just caught her wrist, not roughly, but with the certainty of someone who wouldn't let go, and pulled her from the circle. They moved fast through the forest, his steps cutting a path she couldn't see but somehow trusted enough to follow. By the time they reached the waterfall, the sound of the rush drowned out everything else. The moonlight caught the falling water, breaking it into silver shards that vanished into the black pool below. Hidden behind the curtain of spray, a cabin crouched low against the rock face, its walls dark with age, the roof sagging under a blanket of snow. He pushed the door open without a word. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke. The walls were close, the single room lit only by the dim orange glow from a small stone hearth. She stood in the doorway, dripping meltwater onto the floorboards, while he moved to the table against the wall. He lit a lamp, the soft flame pooling light over the space, the narrow bed, the shelves lined with jars and dried herbs, the bundle of furs folded neatly in the corner. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the bed. Her instinct was to refuse, but her body ached too much to argue. She sat, the fur soft under her hands, the heat from the hearth brushing her chilled skin. He crossed the room with a basin and a strip of cloth. When he knelt before her, setting the basin on the floor, the shadows on his face shifted, the hardness still there, but muted. He reached for her hand. This time, she didn't pull back. His fingers were warm against her chilled skin, steady as he cleaned the blood from her palm. The water stung, and she bit the inside of her cheek to keep from reacting. His touch lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary, his thumb brushing the ridge of her knuckles before he reached for the cloth again. The room was quiet but for the crackle of the fire and the distant rush of the falls. Close enough now, she could see the faint scar running along his jaw, disappearing into the shadow of his beard. She wondered how it had happened, and why she wanted to ask. He moved to the scrape on her forearm, rolling her sleeve up with care. "You should have let me handle them," he said quietly. Her voice was softer than she meant it to be. "I'm not in the habit of waiting to be rescued." That almost smile touched his mouth again, brief and gone. "No. I didn't think you were." He tied the cloth around her arm, fingers brushing her skin in a way that made the air between them feel smaller. When he finally sat back, he didn't move away. The lamplight caught in his eyes, and for the first time she saw past the guarded calm, a flicker of something rawer, heavier. "My brother," he said, the words deliberate, "was killed in a fight that wasn't his." She didn't speak, sensing that if she interrupted, the words would stop. "I trusted the wrong people," he continued. "I believed they'd stand with him. I was wrong. And now," he shook his head once, a small, sharp motion. "Now I trust no one." The confession hung between them, warm and heavy like the air in the cabin. She understood the shape of it. Not the details, but the way loss could carve through trust until nothing was left but the edges. Her hand moved before she thought, resting lightly on his. His gaze dropped to where their skin touched, then rose to meet hers. The fire's light flickered, catching on the line of his cheekbone, the curve of his mouth. They were close enough now that she could feel the warmth of his breath, could see the way his eyes darkened just slightly. He leaned in, not quickly, not carelessly, but with the kind of deliberate slowness that asked a question without words. Her chest tightened. She didn't move back. The distance between them closed to a breath. Her heart pounded hard enough that she was certain he could hear it. And then, a sound outside. Soft, but sharp enough to shatter the moment. He stilled instantly, his body going still in that predator's way again. His head turned toward the door, his hand pulling subtly from hers. The noise came again, the faint crunch of snow, deliberate, moving along the wall of the cabin. He rose without a sound, crossing the floor in 2 steps. When he glanced back at her, the moment they'd almost shared was gone from his expression, replaced by the focus of a man who expected trouble. But before he stepped out, his voice came low, almost under the sound of the falls. When the moon rises again, his eyes held hers, steady and certain. I'll be there. And then he was gone into the night. The night after the cabin, the world shifted again. They came for her at dawn. Not with blades drawn, but with words wrapped in civility sharp enough to cut. 2 messengers, cloaked in the silver and black of his pack, stood at the waterfall's edge. Their faces were unreadable, their voices careful. The Alpha requests your presence. The phrasing left no room for refusal. She followed them back through the forest, the path twisting until the trees gave way to open ground. Ahead, the pack's hall rose from the earth like something carved from the bones of the mountain. Heavy timbers, stone walls blackened with age, banners snapping in the cold wind. It was already full when they entered. The great fire pit burned low at the center, the air thick with smoke and the mingled scents of fur, leather, and too many bodies packed close. They stood in tiers around the walls, eyes following her every step as she crossed the stone floor toward the raised platform at the far end. He was there. The Alpha. Her Alpha now, though no words had ever made it official. His gaze found hers the moment she stepped into the hall. It held her, steady, unreadable, the same storm gray she had seen in the cabin, and yet something in it felt different. One of the elders spoke first, their voice carrying over the crackle of the fire. We gathered to welcome the outsider into our fold. To grant her protection, and to judge her place among us. The word judge clung to the air. She stood silent as they circled her with their questions. About where she had come from, what she could offer the pack. Her answers were brief, careful. She told the truth where she could, and nothing where she could not. It might have worked. If not for what came next. A figure stepped from the crowd, the rival Alpha's second, the one whose blade had nearly cut her down in the stone circle. He carried something in his hands, wrapped in black cloth. When he stopped before the elders, he pulled the cloth away. Inside was a shard of stone. She recognized it instantly, one of the sacred circle's carvings, broken from its place. And burned into its surface, clear as day, was the mark. Her mark. The whispers began immediately. She brought the flame here. The prophecy, it's true. She'll destroy us. Her heart slammed against her ribs. I didn't, but the elder held up a hand, silencing her. Do you deny this is your mark? She looked to him then. The only one whose voice might matter, the only one whose presence might anchor her against the tide turning in the room. He met her eyes. And said nothing. The silence was worse than any accusation. It was absence, cold and complete. The whispers grew louder, hardening into words that struck like stones. Exile her. Send her away before the moon turns. Before it's too late. She felt the heat before she saw it. The silver light sparking at her fingertips, unbidden, answering the rush of humiliation and fury tearing through her. She clenched her fists, but the flame spilled anyway, curling faintly around her hands like smoke. Gasps rippled through the hall. There, someone hissed. The curse. Her breath came too fast, her vision narrowing. The walls pressed in, the eyes, the whispers, the weight of his silence. If he had spoken, if he had stepped forward, if he had said anything, but he didn't. She turned sharply, the heat building in her chest until she thought it would tear her apart. The hall doors slammed open under her hands, the winter air cutting across her skin as she stumbled into the snow. The storm swallowed her instantly, wind screaming through the trees, snow stinging her face. The flame burned brighter now, spilling into the air around her in wild arcs, melting holes into the drifts as she passed. She didn't care who saw. She didn't care if it burned the whole forest down. The only thing that mattered was the distance growing between her and that hall. Between her and him. The storm clawed at her, but she didn't slow. Snow whipped into her face, melted instantly where the heat of the flame licked against her skin, hissed as it hit the ground at her feet. Every step away from the hall drove the fire higher, until her breath steamed like smoke and the air around her shimmered. She didn't know where she was going until she got there. The forest broke open suddenly, the world spilling into the wide, bare clearing of the sacred stone circle. And there, in the silver light of the moon, she saw him. The enemy Alpha stood at the circle's center, flanked by his wolves, their fur bristling in the cold. In his grip, a blade pressed hard against a throat she knew as well as her own heartbeat. The Alpha. Her Alpha. His hands were bound behind him, his knees pressed into the snow. Blood streaked the side of his face where a blow had split the skin. His eyes found hers instantly, not with relief, not even with surprise, but with something unreadable. Something tight. The enemy Alpha's smile was all teeth. "You came," he said, his voice rolling easily over the wind. "Good. Saves me the trouble of hunting you." Her boots sank into the snow as she stepped forward. "What do you want?" He tilted his head toward the man kneeling at his feet. "This one for you. You for the safety of my pack. Seems fair. You think I'd trade myself?" "Oh," he said, mockery curling in his tone, "I think you'd burn yourself alive to save him." The fire inside her roared. For a heartbeat, she considered letting it loose right there, ending him and every wolf at his side. But she knew what the stones meant. She'd felt their hum, the way the prophecy wrapped around this place. If she unleashed the flame here, it wouldn't be contained. And then he dragged the blade across the Alpha's skin just enough to draw a bead of blood. The choice was made for her. She stepped fully into the circle. The air thickened instantly, the hum she'd felt before now a steady pulse that seemed to sync with her own heartbeat. The enemy Alpha's wolves shifted uneasily, hackles rising, but he didn't move. The silver fire came without effort this time. It poured from her hands in streams, curling and twisting in the air like living things. The heat was fierce, but it didn't burn her, it wrapped her instead, a second skin of light and power. Gasps rose from the edges of the clearing as the wolves began to bow, not in submission to her will, but to something older, something in the fire that spoke to the deepest part of their blood. The earth shuddered beneath them. Snow slid from the stones, revealing more of the carvings, glowing faintly as if the flame had woken them. Overhead, the moon bled from silver into deep crimson, its light staining the snow in shades of blood and ash. The enemy Alpha's grip faltered. He looked from her to the man at his feet, and for the first time, his confidence slipped. She moved. The flame surged forward, not in a straight line, but in a sweeping arc that cut the wolves off from their leader, forcing them back without singeing a single hair. Her boots crunched into the snow as she closed the space between them. "Let him go," she said. He sneered, but there was no humor in it now. "Or what? You'll kill me? You think that makes you any less of a monster than they?" She didn't let him finish. The flame surged up her arm, coiled into her palm, and with a single movement, she sent it slamming into the blade. The steel screamed under the heat, glowing white before shattering into fragments that hissed as they hit the snow. The Alpha fell forward into the drift, coughing, the ropes at his wrists burning away to ash before she even touched them. He looked up at her then, really looked, and something passed between them, quick and fierce. Behind them, the enemy Alpha staggered back, but she was already moving again. The flame rose high, casting the entire clearing into daylight bright glow. She could feel the stones answering her, the earth rolling underfoot, the air thick with the scent of ozone and molten frost. She struck once. The fire lanced forward, wrapping around him like chains, dragging him to his knees. The wolves whined low, their ears flat, their bodies pressed into the snow. The blood moon hung heavy overhead, its light pulsing in time with the fire's rhythm. She stepped closer, the heat between them searing, the steam rising from the snow making the air blur. "You don't decide my fate," she said, her voice low and steady. "You don't decide who I am." The flame flared one last time, then snapped back into her palms, leaving him bound in nothing but silence and the weight of his own defeat. But as the circle quieted, as the wolves began to lift their heads, she felt it, a shift in the air that didn't come from her. The shadows beyond the stones moved. Not with the grace of wolves or the stumble of men, but with something slower, heavier, older. A presence she had not felt before, but that felt as though it had been waiting. Her gaze darted to the alpha at her side, but his eyes were already on the tree-line. The blood moon's light wavered. Whatever she had just unleashed, it wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The clearing held its breath. Snow drifted down in slow, lazy spirals, the flakes catching in the last curls of steam rising from the melted ground. The wolves who had knelt were still crouched low, ears flat, eyes flicking between her and the alpha at her side. None of them moved to speak. She could feel their uncertainty as if it were her own heartbeat. Some gazes held gratitude, she had ended a threat they could not face alone. Others held only wariness, the kind that clings after you've seen power you cannot control. The enemy alpha still knelt in the snow, bound not by rope but by something heavier. The unspoken truth that he had been beaten not by steel or claw, but by fire that should not exist. His wolves lingered at the edges, as though unsure if retreat meant survival or surrender. Her breathing slowed, the heat of the silver flame ebbing but not gone. It pulsed faintly under her skin, a reminder that it was still there, waiting. Watching. The alpha beside her said nothing. His presence was steady, a quiet anchor in the shifting air, but even he was not looking at her now. His gaze was fixed on the circle's stones, on the faint silver glow that had not yet faded. The survivors began to gather, not just wolves from his pack, but wanderers who had been drawn to the fight. Faces she didn't know, eyes full of questions she didn't want to answer. One stepped forward. A woman with streaks of white in her dark hair, her shoulders straight but her voice careful. "You saved us." It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't quite thanks either. Another spoke from the back. "Or she doomed us." The words fell into the snow, heavy enough that no one rushed to deny them. She turned slowly, taking them all in, the fear, the awe, the flicker of something else that could become either faith or hatred depending on which way the wind turned. And in that moment, it struck her, this was the choice they would all make now. Not just whether she belonged here, but whether they would follow her, or try to end her. Her voice, when it came, was low but clear, carrying into the silence. "If you were here, if you saw everything I've done tonight, the lives I've taken, the lives I've spared, would you choose me? Or would you turn away?" The question wasn't only for them. It was for the world beyond these stones. For whoever was listening in the stillness between heartbeats. And for you. If this story lit something inside you, subscribe to the Alpha's Romance Library. Here, we tell tales that burn long after the last word fades. The circle began to empty. Not in a rush, not with the chatter of victory, but with the hushed movements of people who had seen something they didn't fully understand and didn't want to name aloud. One by one, the wolves withdrew into the trees, their shape swallowed by the falling snow. The enemy Alpha's second dragged him from the clearing, his head low, his shoulders tight. Not beaten in body, beaten in something far worse. Only she and the Alpha remained. The stones stood silent, their glow fading, though she could still feel the hum of them under her boots, deep and low, as if they were speaking a language too old for her to hear. He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel the heat of him even in the cold. "You shouldn't stay here tonight," he said quietly. The words should have been an order. But they felt like something else. She gave a single nod. They left the circle together, the snow swallowing the sound of their steps. The forest seemed different now, too still, as though holding its breath. Even the wind had gone quiet, the air heavy in a way that made each inhale feel deliberate. They walked until the stones were nothing but a memory behind them. Mist began to curl low over the ground, clinging to their boots, then rising until it ghosted around their knees. It was then the earth shifted. Not the subtle tremor of snow settling on branches, something deeper. The ground beneath them gave a single, low shudder that traveled up through her bones, a pulse that did not belong to the forest she knew. She stopped. So did he. The mist thickened, curling into shapes the eye couldn't quite hold. Somewhere behind them, far enough to blur in the whiteness, but close enough to hear, a voice spoke. It was not loud. It didn't need to be. She is not the only one. The words seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the ground, from the air, from the space just behind her shoulder. Cold licked along her spine. She turned slowly, her gaze cutting through the mist. There was nothing. Only the trees, silent and watchful, and the snow falling steady. But the air felt wrong now. Heavy. Crowded. Her eyes burned, a sudden, sharp heat that made her vision tighten and sharpen. The world around her deepened in color. The red of the blood moon still lingering low on the horizon, the black veins of tree branches against it. She caught her reflection faintly in the ice crusting a fallen log. Silver. Her eyes glowed silver. She didn't look away. Neither did the forest. This isn't over. Fade to silence.